So, Ant, would you like to take us through what you're going to cover today?
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, it is a very interesting topic, I think, this one. Good intellectual puzzle behind this. It's all around this idea of AI, artificial intelligence. So effectively, we're kind of going to go through three things. First, we're going to spend a little bit of time in a not too technical way, hopefully, just talking about what we mean by AI. What is it? And very specifically, recently there's been buzz around generative AI. So we're going to really explore what that concept is and hopefully leave that segment with you having a clear picture of what we mean by these terms. From there, we're going to have a little look at what it can do. So a little kind of demonstration, discussion of what that might mean conceptually. But then we're going to finish with hopefully something practical and useful that you can take away, which is, okay, so given that, now we know what it is, we know what it looks like, we know what it can do. What do we need to consider when thinking about this in the context of our organizations, our processes, the things we do? Because there are new and unique challenges that come with these new and unique technologies and approaches. So that's the structure of the session today. But exactly as Rich said, yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic. So any questions, please do put them in, as Rich said, and I'm sure we'll get time to discuss those. And I look forward to doing that.
Yeah, and there's a couple of polls we should mention as well. So we will be putting those into the using the Q&A functionality to ask you, but to ask where your organisations are. But we're really interested in as Anthony steps through these topics, sharing as much as you can. Some of the challenges you're facing, some of the questions you've got. Do keep that coming. I'm really interested to get a sense of the different perspectives given the audience we've got with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So let's begin. What is AI? I think on this question, it's actually quite useful just to take a breath for a second, right? So just think for a second. What do you feel, just inside your own head, what do you feel like the answer to this is? What's your definition of AI? Just give yourself 5 to 10 seconds for words to appear and just pay attention to what those words are. You're probably thinking it's about technology, it's about software, it's about solutions, it's about ever cleverer stuff that I interact with. You might be thinking of Siri maybe on your phone if you're an Apple user, or you might be thinking of Google and the things it does. That feels like AI. I think the technical definition is actually quite unhelpful, because the most basic technical definition of artificial intelligence is that when we talk about AI, we're talking about the discipline for making artificial systems which can perform person-like tasks. So I'll say that again. It's the discipline for making any artificial system which can perform a person-like task. Now, the reason I think this is in some ways an unhelpful definition is because, as silly as it sounds, you could go all the way back to the irrigation systems of ancient Egypt and describe that as, an artificial system that was doing something that only a person used to be able to do. In this case, carrying water into the fields and tipping it out. But we're not thinking of that, obviously. We're thinking about technology. And up to now, those kinds of applications I've talked about, they've been impressive. Google, very, very impressive, very good at finding that information for you very quickly. And capabilities that you may be familiar with, and you may have experimented with as an organization, like robotic process automation, again, very impressive, but they're very, very narrow. There hasn't been that collective wow factor, where we look at the piece of technology and we say, no, that's intelligent. That's not reading from a script. That's an intelligence. That's doing what I'm doing fundamentally within my wetware up here. And maybe there's an assumption, rightly or wrongly, that and we'll probably never get there. That's probably a bit of a pipe dream. Now, I'm not about to say, well, you're wrong and that's all changed. I think the situation's much more complicated than that. But that's what we're going to explore today. There's been a lot of noise, if you like, recently around AI. And it's definitely a time when it's now worth considering what this could mean for us, what this could mean for our processes. So first, what I want to do is, in order to define what we mean by AI beyond the technical definition, is I kind of want to group the technology we've been interacting with into three different distinct categories that hopefully flow logically for you. And I want to start with what I would refer to as the initial approach to making intelligent software. So you see, I've avoided saying AI, I'm just saying intelligent software. So for years, for the majority of certainly our lives and our careers, the technology we've been interacting with is quite algorithmic in its nature, right? So what happens is we build software via explicit instructions. It's all been designed around if this, then that. And if you've ever coded something, you kind of recognize this. There are different languages, but fundamentally it boils down to, if this, then that. Now, there's more to it, of course. I'm massively simplifying here. In most software, there are clever mathematical functions and formulas that also tie in with the ifs and the thens to deliver these really wonderful outputs that we're so reliant on. But fundamentally, the game that this is playing is, let's put an input into our software and it will follow the explicit instructions and provide an expected output. And this is great because A, we can get this, we've been able to get these pieces of software to do some really clever things for us. But B, if we are in doubt over an output, it's actually fairly straightforward, with an asterisk if you've ever worked in programming, but it's fairly straightforward. It's at least possible and plausible to look under the hood of the machine and figure out what in my if this then that chain of logic went wrong, right? It's kind of auditable in a way, understandable. But there is a constraint with this. And the constraint sounds really obvious, but it's worth saying out loud. And it's this. These pieces of software that we used, they can only handle that which the instructors foresaw. So if it's not in the instructions, the software won't handle it. All right, so the analogy I use is, you build some sort of an app, some sort of software for providing recipes to people. Okay, you can imagine in this software that what you've got is a list of predefined recipes, and you maybe might group them into culinary themes, and then you're going to build some sort of a logic flow that takes users through a series of screens that takes them from I'm hungry all the way through to oh, here's a recipe for me to cook. I'm going to cook X. But the problem is, if I say, well, I want to cook, let's say it's a lasagna, I'm going to cook a lasagna, but actually I don't have these ingredients available. I have these other ingredients, and I want to put a bit of a Mexican twist on it.
Sounds delicious.
Well, sounds delicious. And that used to be my favorite thing at the canteen in financial services where I used to work, the Mexican lasagna. But
we've
our system
got quite a
cannot
lot
handle it.
of Italian participants in this, so feel free to react as you choose.
Oh yes, of course, can't besmirch the Italian cuisine. Yes, that is sacrilege, but it was delicious sacrilege. And the problem with our app that we've created hypothetically is that it cannot handle that scenario. Right? It's not clever. It's not in the script. So we move them therefore into a different category of computing, a different type of approach. Right? We don't want to write down explicit instructions. If you take the challenge of, I've got a whole bunch of photographs of apples and oranges, and I need something that can magically tell me whether it's an apple or an orange. The kind of, as easy as that job sounds, there aren't explicit instructions. We as humans just learned, we over the years of interacting with fruits. So the question became for computer science, well, why can't we do the same with machines? So if you've ever come across the concept of machine learning, that's kind of now what we're talking about. So this is a shift in how we do computing to instead creating a simulation effectively of neurons, what our wetware in our brains, our neurons do. So what we do is we create these simulations. We can even create very specific simulations where in particular we're bothered about, say, the neurons of the visual cortex, right? We want to simulate their behavior very well. And then, exactly like with a human being, we train that network, right? We give it a whole bunch of photos of apples and oranges, And like a child, we tell it, no, that's an apple, that's an orange, right? We score it, we manage it actively. But then the clever part comes, because once this neural network has stabilized, once it's learned, if you like, we can now give it a novel new input, so an apple that it hasn't seen before. And even though it's not seen that specific apple before, it can perform, if you like, the same kind of magic, if you want to call it that our brains do, and it can say, that's an apple. So it's a neat trick, and it's been really, really useful. But it has been available for a while. I don't think this will be massively news to anyone. If you think of things that you're using in your day-to-day life now, like facial recognition, or perhaps your bank uses fraud detection, this is really great at categorizing things and making very simple decisions. Right, maybe sentiment analysis in your CRM system, in your customer relationship management system. These clever systems that tell you, oh, this email has a complaining tone to it. This is how we got there. So again, the key takeaway from this slide is it's very different than the previous way of computing. That's key takeaway number one. And key takeaway number two is that it can handle things that aren't in the script, if you like. It handles novel new inputs. All right, but again, this has been around for a while. All right, the initial approach of if you like, algorithmic processing, executing predefined processes, we've had that for years. We've had this breakthrough in machine learning in the early 2010s. What's happened recently is that there's been a couple of very technical breakthroughs, which for our purposes, we don't need to go into in depth. But really, this has involved two things. One, AI's having, or these neural networks getting the ability through complexity to have what's called attention and self-attention, which again, it sounds such a simple thing, but having the ability for an AI to, if you like, pay attention but understand that there's context around the thing it's paying attention to, and for the AI to be able to direct its gaze, if you like, so to speak, at different parts of a long context, opens up whole new capabilities, right? Opens up the capability for conversation, iteration, generation, right? And then the second breakthrough is around scale, right? We were able to do this and build these networks at bigger and bigger scale, right? So bigger brains, if you like. So what happens if you start feeding these very big, very clever brains, simulated albeit, that have an ability to kind of think and have attention and direct attention? What happens if you start training it on things like, I don't know, let's say all of the text on the internet? Well, you start to get these, or all of the pictures on the internet. You start to get these solutions, these capabilities of being able to truly generate things, create new images, new art, new music, new conceptual content. That's the most recent one in terms of ChatGPT, where you're having this discourse and thoughts and ideas are being generated seemingly. So this all sounds very good, doesn't it? We have, in the case of ChatGPT, which has made probably most of the news as a generative AI, we have this, let me just use my pointer for a second. We have this neural network. It's called a transformer model. And we've got obviously a whole load of other supporting technology around it. But what it's now able to do is when we feed it a text prompt, when we ask it a question, it gives us an answer. But a bit like with our own brains, why it gave that exact answer, you can't look under the hood in the same way that you could with older technology. You can't simply trace back why it's giving you that answer. In fact, if you ask it the same question verbatim twice in a row in two different occasions, it will give you the same answer but phrased differently. Right? Which again, it's to be expected, right? If I ask Rich, his opinion on something first thing in the morning, but then I ask him his opinion on it after lunch, he's still Rich. He's going to have the same opinions, but maybe he's had lunch now and he's much more considered in his approach, and he speaks a little bit more
hungry. Yeah,
exactly. You're not you when you're hungry, as Snickers tells us, right? So, but that's the point, right? It a bit like us, you get the same answer, but it's a little bit different. Okay, so this is all very fascinating. Why have we gone through this description? Well, again, we can't really talk about AI and generative AI until we've defined what we mean and we understand fundamentally what it's doing, right? It shifts your intuitions about what's possible, right? You suddenly start to think, oh, well, and I wonder if it could, It also raises that concern and that flag that I've just planted, which is that how an AI makes its decisions, at least right now, is unknown and possibly unknowable, right? Just like with a person, the best we can do is describe what kind of a network we've built and what kind of data it was fed to train it and how we scored it. We can talk about that, but we can't directly trace the reasons behind its decisions. So, given that, I thought it might be logical at this point to just take a brief pause and ask a question. So the question is, which of these statements do you feel best describes your organization's relationship to AI? So we've got 5 answers. You know, you might feel like you're completely out the loop, you don't know anything about it. Maybe you're aware of it, but not much beyond that. Perhaps you've got some ideas, you kind of can see how you would use it as an organization, but maybe you're not ready. You might have actively engaged in it and maybe had some issues, challenges. That would be interesting to know too. Or maybe, you know, AI is very aligned with your industry and actually you've been using it quite well, and you've seen some results. We'd just like to get a feel from the audience as to kind of where you are in your organizations.
So folks, you should see in the chat that the answers Anthony's described on screen are appearing. If you just take a couple of moments just to think about where you're at, as Anthony says, and then simply put a thumbs up next to the one that best represents your organization's position. So all of those 5 should be now available and visible. He says, hopefully. There we go. Okay, so they're all in the chat. Just click in the Q&A, sorry. You've got discussion there, and under each one there is an option to react to each one. Just give a thumbs up against the one that best represents your organization's position. Slightly curious that no one has done that yet. Oh, there we go, few. So we're having a responsive issue. Is either the question or not. Okay, so I can see people are starting to respond to that. So simply whichever one best represents your organization, put a thumbs up next to it. See what we've got. So Anthony, just while people are doing that, what were you hoping to get out of this by asking this question?
Yeah, well, the rest of the session, so everything else that we're going to talk about, is then really around the, well, we're going to talk about what it looks and feels like, but for this practical piece at the end, I think it can be tailored somewhat in terms of, you know, the advice that we want to give you, the examples that Rich and I might use, I think can be tailored based on this response. So I think if most of it, it'd be interesting to know if most of the audience feels like they're kind of out of the loop or on the lower end of the spectrum, we might end up exploring the use cases a little bit more. You know, well, what could we use this for? How do I get the creative juices flowing? I think if we're on the other end of the spectrum, it might be more interesting to spend a bit more time on the risks, concerns, challenges, and practical considerations.
Okay, so if you are, this is a new method we're using here, folks. If anyone is having any problems with it, just drop us a note. That'd be useful to know. So we've got a bit of a split. Not much, given the size of the audience that's in here, it makes me slightly dubious that we're getting a representative sample here, but we've got a bit of a split. We haven't got any responses on number 4, and that's about it at the moment. Anthony, we've got responses against others, ranging from we feel out of the loop, right through to we have got people who say we know all about it and we know how we plan to use it. So at either end of that spectrum and anywhere in between, if that's the case, let us know your thoughts in the chat. Why is that the case? What are you working on? In what applications are you putting this to use? It'd be really useful to hear about that. So do share on the chat. Be
Yeah.
fascinating to hear from you. Similarly, if you have been unable to see those responses or the ability to respond and do the thumbs up on them, just let us know, because this is a bit of an experiment. We're trying to simplify the method of data collection. So voice of the customer, very important. But given we've got less than 5% response, I'm a bit dubious. I've done too many of these things to know otherwise.
Okay.
Cool. So a spread is your answer, Anthony.
A spread. Okay. Well, in that case, again, it will be really interesting as we get into the risks for those who answered, option 5, to hear if those have manifested at all, and if so, what was that like? Okay, so for those of us who maybe answered more on the sort of 1, 2, 3 area of the poll, might be useful to just take a moment to look at these capabilities and demonstrate what they can do. Now, my favorite mechanism for demonstrating or making the case that this generative AI, this new wave, is fundamentally different even than the fraud detection type capabilities, is to show something that can only be answered by intelligence with a capital I, if you like. And in order to do that, I came up with this. It's a question that I feel is ungoogleable, but anyone with intelligence can answer it. Right, and that is me asking the machine, a boy and a girl walk down the street. The girl falls over and looks up at the boy. The boy turns and walks away, and the girl starts crying. Why is the girl crying? Okay, so I made this story up. You can't Google this. There's no Googleable answer. You also can't really answer it algorithmically in that initial approach. And I use ChatGPT in this instance, but of course, these new waves of generative AI give very, very interesting and accurate answers to these questions. So in this example, the AI is able to say, well, the girl is crying because the boy, instead of helping her up or showing concern, walked away. And it talks about, that might be an emotional reason, could be about not feeling supported, feeling vulnerable. A very, very reasonable response. All right. And again, not one that could have been given by any of those first 2 categories of technology and intelligence that we talked about. But I wanted to push it a step further. So I ask a follow-up question. I want you, the machine, the AI, to ask me, the human, 2 questions to clarify this situation. And based on my answers, I want then you to give me a more precise explanation for the girl crying. Okay, so this is to demonstrate this idea that it's interactive, right? It's discursive. We can have a conversation with this thing, and it can keep its attention and direct its attention within a context. So the machine asked me 2 questions. Dutifully, it asks, what's the boy's demeanor or expression when he turns and walks away? What did he look like? And do the boy and a girl have any prior history? Now, again, I think it's interesting to note here that those are 2 very reasonable questions to ask. I think if you ask most people or took most people down the same line of inquiry, they would probably give you these questions back again. So I answered the questions, but I picked my answers very specifically. For question 1, I just simply said that the boy looked amused. But for question 2, I said that they go to the same school as each other, but they've never actually spoken to each other. They just happen to be on the same street at the same time. Now, I chose this deliberately because in my head, I was concocting a story and I wanted to see just how good this context and attention setting was. And would it be able to think creatively and say, oh, well, perhaps she's worried about maybe, the implications at school, maybe getting teased or something like that. Okay. Now, I might say disappointingly, I didn't get that answer back. I got a slightly longer answer. I agree is a bit more detailed than the first explanation, but it didn't fundamentally, it certainly didn't meet my expectation of the story I was hinting at. But I'm also very willing to acknowledge and should say that, well, not all people that I presented those answers to would. They wouldn't just guess at my head story. But I think this is a great example because it really sums up, I think, where we are as of November 2023, which is, wow, that's intelligent with a capital I, but it's not perfect. It's not, there is still work to be done on this. All right, so this is a good summary of where we've gotten to. But just to really push the concept, there's one final question which I asked ChatGPT's cousin, DALL-E. So DALL-E's job is to take text prompts, and rather than respond to them with text, it responds to them by generating an image. So I said, well, generate a photorealistic image of a boy and a girl walking down the street, and the girl has tripped over. And this was the image it generated. It's the one you've been looking at over to the left. Now, yes, there's a little bit of sleight of hand here in terms of the formatting of these slides, but when you really sit and look at this, you do notice a few things that give it away as not a genuine image, not a genuine photograph. You know, there's clearly some instability on the boy's face when you look closely, and probably on the girls as well. There's something going on with the rendering at the end of all of these legs and arms. If you look at everyone's hands and feet, they don't quite look like they've been rendered correctly by the software. And really, when you start to look at the detail off in the distance, you know, those aren't people. Those are just wispy specters that sort of look like people. Funnily enough, that I think the best way to summarize what we've got back is a hallucination that almost looks like reality. It's almost like a mind's eye picture of with just not quite the right things everywhere. So what's it being used for outside of little tricks like this? What are the productive use cases? I'm seeing some coming in by the chat as well. It'd be interesting if you have some from your organizations. Just as a quick overview of what's going on out there right now. Obviously, process automation is a big deal. You can see where this kind of capability can be used to carefully automate processes and do things that before would have required maybe a human level response. A great example of this down here of these tools for generating instructional videos, right? Before, you would have had to have someone stand in front of a camera and read a script. Now there are many enterprise grade services where you as an enterprise can just submit some text, and within a minute or two, you've got a full 10-minute video, which almost seems to break the laws of physics, of a person talking that looks and sounds like a real person. And it's just generated by effectively an artificial intelligence. Another piece is the war for search. This is quite a big deal. And I kind of lump this in with, in general, now that we have these language models that can produce text and code, which aren't just text, they contain concepts. How can we use that with other pieces of technology to do things that we never thought would be possible? So in the war for search, the example is, well, what if these AIs could do a Google search for you, but then read the Google search and provide you with the qualitative answer to the question you actually asked, i.e. getting you, the user, out of having to click through the search results and come to your conclusion. Now, you can argue, is that a good thing or a bad thing in this world? Taking away people's ability to look through the data and come to a conclusion. We're not here to discuss that. The other, I think, element that's quite big and I think is really promising across not just the education world, but inside organizations as well, is learning and productivity. Learning is such a key part of what we do, especially in our careers. It does not end with university. And therefore, having the ability to, say to something like a generative AI, provide me with a summary of this topic and let me ask you questions about it. We have to be careful, but that capability is going to be absolutely transformative and already is proving to be so. There is the negative end of the spectrum where, as a student, you can say, write me my 2,000-word essay on ancient Egypt and irrigation and do it in the style of ... That's a concern and a challenge that I know is increasing in academia at the moment. So a lot of use cases. I'll pause. Rich, have you got any to add from the chat?
Yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to share before you moved on to the next section, actually, Andy, if I may. So just in terms of comments, we've got the first thing I should point out is on the poll, it refreshed, and we had the most popular answer was the one I said we had none on, which is answer number 4. We've given it a go, and it's trickier than we thought. Yes, I can relate to that. So that's the most popular answer we had, which is an interesting experience. I've got a few comments. We're actively using across many of our companies wider offerings, although we're always looking for more use, if appropriate, in brackets. Great to hear. And also, we've been okayed by IT to use ChatGPT for general information gathering and Excel formula writing. And someone else earlier on in the conversation pointed out that Microsoft Copilot, of course, those of you on with active Windows updates will have seen they've recently enhanced that and put it into the Windows taskbar as well as the Office 365 suite. Yeah, interesting to experiment with, and I know you're going to talk about some safe experiments later on, Anthony, which I think that leans quite heavily on Copilot, given the infiltration of the 365 suite across most people's work.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's two things I found really interesting there. The poll response for being the most selected, that's kind of what I'd expected coming into this, because it's too tempting of a fruit not to reach for, but it's also too complex of a fruit to just be able to eat and stay clean the first time. So I expected that might be the case, and we'll maybe think about that in the next section a little bit. And yes, those use cases I think are probably where everyone will start. The stuff coming out from Microsoft is really exciting. But what does it mean for our improvement efforts? What can we do and what should we learn? The only responsible way to think about this topic, I think, is to start with a really honest and transparent discussion about the risks. And for me personally, I think the biggest and most frustrating risk at the moment, certainly with things like ChatGPT, is this risk of hallucinations. So hallucinations aren't just limited to these visuals that look slightly warped. In fact, when people use hallucination in the AI context, they're actually usually thinking of ChatGPT or one of the language models. And what they're talking about is this ability for them, or this proclivity that they sometimes have to make erroneous or incorrect statements, but that sound plausible and are stated with authority. Yeah, okay, the worst kind of statement that you can make when you're trying to do some research, right? So that's a problem. It's a big problem. They also don't handle and tend to hallucinate on things that are to do with maths and arithmetic. So if you ask one of these AIs to do some basic maths, it sometimes will do it, but it sometimes will very confidently give you the completely wrong answer, right? Because again, it's not doing, when you talk to a person and you say, if I say to Rich, what's 7 times 9? Rich will pause for a second, and in that pause, he switches his brain into maths mode. He's not talking to me anymore. He's calculating something now. This is just a language model. So when you ask it what's 2 plus 2, it just talks to you and says what it thinks sounds plausible. It's a really nuanced distinction, but that's fundamentally why these things feel like they hallucinate very often. It's because they almost fool us into believing that they're genuinely, generalized when they're not. So we have to watch for that. The next one, I think there's been major strides in this risk over 2023. If I'd have been talking to you in February, I would have said this was actually the main problem. It's not anymore, but it is still a challenge. These things can go down. It can be impossible to sign into them. They can lag very heavily. The performance of them is subject to wild variation, which of course we know is not great for introducing it into processes, right? We could potentially be introducing a source of variation there. The next risk, and a key risk for all organizations, is that of security. If you ask ChatGPT a question about your organization, maybe you've got a challenge and you think, let's see what ideas ChatGPT could give us. Or if you feed a text-based description into one of these, sites where they're generating videos for you, where's that text gone? Once it goes into the AI, where's that gone? Is it stored somewhere? What is the AI using that? Can it be used to refine the AI? These are all still open questions, and it's not actually clear. So a great piece of advice is don't include in your text-based prompt or in your interactions anything that's sensitive. Would probably be a sensible piece of advice, at least for now.
But a massive compliance issue there, isn't it, Anto, in terms of diffuse access to these things? How do you control that at an organizational level? Virtually impossible.
Yeah. It's kind of like with the self-driving car market, and it suddenly opens up all of these just new logistical questions, exactly as you say. And that segues into this other risk around intellectual property, which is a different risk than the security. Because even if we can solve that security concern, there's then this interesting question of whose intellectual property is this, right? Because currently there is no country around the world that allows an AI to own intellectual property.
Yeah.
But AI is now generating ideas, it's generating art. And it's even more complicated than that because, well, what data was used to train that AI? You know, if I use all of Rich's artwork to train an AI and it becomes as good as at art as Rich is, well, is Rich not owed something here? You know, ChatGPT has been fed with all of the text on the internet. We've all helped build it, but we're not all going to get the reward. Potentially, no, we don't know. So there's a quick quote I'll read from the National Law Review, which just said that the big question right now is whether developers of these applications have already infringed the IP rights of content owners based on the content that was ingested to create them, and whether such developers could be considered liable, you know, where issues arise with copyrighted material. You know, the AI says something that's a copyrighted phrase. How do we deal with that? Don't know. And that's especially exacerbated by this last problem, the black box problem. Because again, you can't just fiddle subtly with the AI so that it doesn't do that again. It's a bit of a black box. You have to retrain it. It's a complicated and difficult scenario. You know, think about how we traditionally like to audit our processes and audit our machines and systems, especially in heavily regulated environments. This challenge could pose a real challenge if it's just fundamentally not auditable in that way that we're used to.
Yeah, and I guess many of our audience will be aware that there's an international summit on some of these topics next week being hosted in the UK, which will be interesting to see which one of these they focus on. So, Anthony, let's jump into what opportunities there are here for the improvement practitioner.
Yeah, sure. So, I think some have come up. We talked about Microsoft Copilot. I really like the one of Excel formulas. You know, how many times do we, even if we're not big Excel users, do we nudge that person in the office who's great at Excel and say, oh, show me the formula, write me the formula to do this? Again, you know, ChatGPT can do that. You know, we talked about research. We've talked about generating videos. All of those use cases aside, I think the thing to actually focus on is this model over to the right here, where, again, at least for now, we should always be sat between our end customer from a process point of view and any AI that we're interacting with. Okay, and that's the best mitigation for some of these security and other concerns that we talked about. All right, so we're not feeding in things that are confidential, but we're also not just providing the AI's answers as if they're going to be right 100% of the time, or the content that it creates will always go through some kind of a filtering process. So I think what's probably, given the survey responses, it's probably best to spend our time really thinking about the practical side of that then. So how and what do we need to do? So thinking first about the people who maybe answered that initial poll as, you know, a 1, a 2, a 3. First thing you're going to need to do then, if you're completely unaware, is get access to one of the available tools. You might start, as some of the people in the chat have said, with things like ChatGPT or Copilot, where that's freely available or available to you at enterprise level, or you might sign up for one of those video creation services, following your normal processes for that and due diligence. But once you're there, you're ready to begin experimenting with some of those low risk use cases. So again, from the poll, it sounds like a lot of you are at this station on the tube map. You're experimenting with those low risk use cases, in which case a couple of pieces of advice and hopefully practical things you can do. So, of course, we must carefully review responses for hallucinations. Given everything we've said, it would be irresponsible not to show that as a specific thing that we do in our journey. But I think the more interesting challenge is on this behavioral line of the tube. The first behavioral change you're going to have to make, I think, is to unlearn what I'm calling the Google trim down ritual. And what I mean by this is, over the past 15 to 20 years, we have all built a habit of knowing how to write a set of words to put into Google. And that set of words is nonsense. It's not a sentence. It's not a clear question, because Google doesn't handle clear questions. We're rigging it with just the right combination of nouns and verbs and things, such that the results we get back will be the most relevant to us. You have to unlearn that, and that learned behavior actually gets in your way of using these new systems, right? You have to think of the nuance. You have to be very creative, ask big, broad questions, and then have some back and forth with these AIs to refine the output. And therefore, you're going to have to learn a whole new type of patience, and you're going to want to be very interrogative, right? Again, this sounds really obvious, but we've never done this before with technology. So every instinct we have probably runs against us in this regard, right? You just wouldn't think to ask again or ask a follow-on question. Making those lights come on, as the sooner you can turn them on, the sooner you'll start producing some really useful stuff with this new technology. But the most important stop on this tube map, and if you take nothing else away from this presentation that's practical, it is this. Sounds really simple, but it's all about the final stop on this journey should always be adding your value. Okay, this is not, if we're asking the question, well, what can the AI do magically for me? I've found that's often not the helpful question to ask. Yeah. The helpful question to ask is, how can we, as weird as it sounds, me and this AI, achieve a goal together? And what's my value? What am I looking to add in my process? And as a piece of advice you can take that should be generic and apply to all of the organizations and use cases, I would strongly advocate for that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Anthony, I'm just thinking this slide I'll commit us to providing this as an infographic next week. I think it's really useful with the concepts, and I can see with resonating with the audience, the distinction you're doing between the behavioural line and the practical line is really interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, hopefully this will be useful to you, especially for those of you where most of us answered on the poll question 4, which is we've tried and it's tricky. Maybe coming back to that core concept of adding your value in PDSA will be helpful. Given that, then I just wanted to finish with something maybe a little bit philosophical, but I think an interesting question again, just to open our minds. Any of you who've been trained by us will probably recognize this slide. But when we're visualizing, when we're talking about our processes, for about a century, we've been able to talk about our processes as having these 5 categories of inputs. There are many inputs that a process can have, but these 5 categories have been a really useful way of framing them. And that hasn't changed. I'm not about to tell you that all goes out the water. But what I do think is an interesting question is just asking, as an input, where does AI belong? Because fundamentally, given everything we've discussed, you can see why it might not quite belong conceptually in the same box as the rest of the machines do. Right, given these different concerns, these concerns that typically we've only had to worry about with people, like giving slightly different answers at different times of day. So, it could be that we start to think of, maybe in the short term, AI as being just a whole new input that we want to treat very carefully and maybe differently than other things we've experimented and done PDSA with in our processes. But there's a third alternative, which is, again, a bit philosophical, a bit mind-bending, but I did want to end on that, which is that, maybe what's happening here is that because we've created intelligences that aren't human, what's actually happening is that we are separating out just intelligence itself as an input to processes. You know, that magic spark that makes the lovely artwork, or the wonderful response to the customer. The thing we've always banked on for however many thousands of years must come from a human. It's might be a bit different now, and therefore maybe all of the rest of what used to be in people is the more human side of process inputs. That's probably for a future time, but really just wanted to open our minds and think about how different this could be as an input to our processes.
Yeah, and we've got a comment on that supports that in terms of it being a tool and not a solution, and indeed as a method.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It touches many of the other of the other categories.
Fantastic.
So, to sum up, then, key points, key takeaways. I think we've made a strong case that generative AI, we've defined what it is, and we've said it is a different beast to that which came before. I hope I've made a good point that, or a good case that, this is not simply the tech of 2022, but faster or better. There's something new here. There are risks that we must be aware of. Okay, I made that point very, very strongly. But those risks can't cripple us, and we're going to need to change our habits to get the most out of it. That's a really key point, is that this, again, it won't be like what came before. We're going to have to change our habits and think very carefully. And it does represent a significant and growing opportunity, right? Intelligence in general is a really important thing to us, just as a civilization, right? These aren't going to go away. They're going to get better. You'd imagine the hallucinations will get worse. Security will get better. Hopefully we will have as pain-free a process of establishing the regulations as possible, but it's out there, so we want to take advantage of that. And that final point, that however AI does engage with our processes, which will be different for all of our different organizations, it will present a fundamentally new challenge for us and for our customers, our clients, those we work with.
And I think I'd add to that, Anthony, just to round off. This, as I made this point when I presented a webinar last year, I think it was on automation, digital automation specifically. This stuff, whether it's a method or tool, and that view you take it, the AI tools and methods are absolutely, it's essential that they are in the hands of the continuous improvement practitioners. More importantly, the continuous improvement practitioners are at the forefront of their implementation. These aren't just left as tech solutions that are this other thing floating out over there. They will critically change your work. They will critically change our collective work. And it is therefore our mandate to ensure that we're helping equip you guys with the skills that you need as far as possible. So on that note, we, as you well know, we send voice of the customer surveys out. We're really interested in the 2024 schedule, which we're currently shaping up. If there's a specific aspect, a specific dynamic of this topic that you'd like us to feature, let us know in that survey. The final question asks you for suggestions for future PMI Live topics. We're working on that at the moment, so if there's something you've heard today that you'd really like us to go into more detail, we will get Anthony back and get him to do some more work on this subject, and really excited to share that with you, so do let us know. So finally from us, just before we finish out in the last couple of minutes, PMI, as you well know, has a range of podcasts. And one of them is our Uncommon Sense podcast. The most popular of the year has been the one on the left here, which was last month's, which is Process Redesign in the 5 R's with our colleague Sean Buckland. All the podcasts are available. The 2 podcasts we've got are available on all the podcast platforms where you can subscribe to them. But if you want to be the first to know about all of our brand new episodes, all the latest thought leadership content that we put out, including that infographic that we'll get out next week, do follow us on LinkedIn. So search for Process Management International on LinkedIn and click follow the company page, or you can scan that QR code that is there. And very finally from us is next month's PMI Live, when projects don't go right. So this came by popular demand. We're going to explore what to do. Why does that happen? And what circumstances does that happen? Really interesting topic. Really looking forward to that. That's on Friday, the 24th of November. Can't believe we're talking November at 3 p.m. UK time. You can register now on the QR code or the URL that is on the page. As ever, we're here. Do get in touch with us, team@pmi.co.uk. Link in with Anthony and myself if you'd like to take the discussion any further. Really great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. Wishing you a happy weekend. Thanks, Anthony. Really great discussion.
Thanks, everyone, and happy weekend. Happy Friday.
I'll take that.